Good morning, everyone. Hear me all right? Good. Good morning. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Confluence design patterns, and that is really getting the most out of your add-ons inside of Confluence to give the best user experience. So, my name's Ryan Thomas. I'm actually not a Confluence developer anymore. I'm now a team lead for Atlassian on Demand. However, I was a Confluence developer, so I did a bit of this stuff before. My email address and Twitter handle are up there, so feel free to shoot me any questions about this now or at a later date, and I'll try and get the answer back to you. And if I don't, I'll try and find someone who can. So the way we're going to run today is there's sort of 4 categories of patterns I'd like to go over, and then dive into them, and some of the implementation details we can go through. A lot of these aren't going to be diving down into the core code or showing too much code in this. There's only a very little amount of code. I just show you the concepts and then provide you the links to where you can get all the details and implementation and tutorials for that. The first pattern we're going to cover today is one called the in-context pattern. And that is ensuring that content you create inside of the Confluence editor, the content your plugins create, is contextually relevant. When do you use a macro? When do you use a link or an image? How can you capture data that the user pastes into the editor? We'll also look at one that we've called the notification pattern. And that is, how do you notify administrators that maybe some configuration needs to be done for your plugin? How do you notify them what's changed, what's new there? How do you get them started actually using and getting the best experience with your plugin? We'll look at one that's called You're Too Big. Now, this is where your macro may grow in size. You may have tons and tons of parameters. You grow too large for the macro editor inside the Confluence editor, or you have some better way of representing parameters, or you simply want to provide a more seamless user experience when you go to edit macros inside of the Confluence editor. And the final one we'll look at is what we've called the 90%. And that is catering for the 90% use case. Don't try and cater for the 100%. If you cater for the 90%, you'll be doing good enough. And that is making sure you have required parameters. Are they really required? Can you set some sort of sane default? Can you push out common functionality out of the macro editor and into the property panel for macros inside of Confluence? Now, this is primarily a plugins to presentation. A lot of these things are primarily plugins to. However, watch for this, because some of this functionality is already implemented and available in Atlassian Connect. So you can use some of these in Atlassian Connect. So before we go on, I'm sure everyone here's heard of the term design pattern. But for those that haven't, a design pattern really is just a general reusable solution for a commonly occurring problem. Okay? Some of these usability issues are just commonly occurring problems, and we go to provide solutions through plugin points and extensions for your plugins. The first one we'll cover is, as I mentioned earlier, the editor pattern for in-context, the in-context pattern. Now, there'll be a lot of links in these slides. They're quite big links, but the slides will be available after this presentation, so don't worry about trying to copy them down. You can then scrape the slides for all the links to all the tutorials. Now, this in-context pattern is really about ensuring that anything you render or any object you create inside of the Confluence editor is contextually relevant. So the first scenario we have is that when you have a vanilla macro placeholder, now I assume you may be familiar with macro placeholders inside of Confluence, the little gray box with the macro name in it and a couple of the parameters listed. Maybe that does not give enough context. Maybe it's not rich enough for that real rich WYSIWYG editing experience you want the user to have. And the very first solution we can come up with here is to instead use the image-based placeholders. That is, take this macro, here you can see the include page macro, just a gray macro placeholder box, and replace that with something a bit more rich for the user to edit, such as Gliffy Diagrams, the widget connector, or the status macro. All of these render as images inside of the editor. So the macro gives you this image instead of just a gray macro placeholder. I know things like the Gliffy diagram one is fantastic because I have pages full of Gliffy diagrams, and when I go to edit that page, it's very easy for me as a user to see which diagram I need to edit. Same with the status macro. We do a lot of status reporting in our Confluence instances, and I'll have tables and tables of the status macro highlighting what the status is of various items. It's very easy for me at a glance to see the status of these rather than just a grey placeholder. So they're very good at enhancing the WYSIWYG experience for your users inside of the Confluence editor, really enhancing that editing experience. But the best thing about them is they're extremely easy to retrofit to your existing bodiless macros and plugins. So very easy to do, and there's a complete tutorial available on developer.atlassian.com. Now, by the end of this, you're going to get sick of me saying developer.atlassian.com, but I just find it to be such a fantastic resource for all these types of things. There are so many tutorials, so many how-to guides, and just documentation on how to get the best out of the Atlassian plugin system. And of course, this is already available in Atlassian Connect. You can create a remote macro with an image-based placeholder today in Confluence, so it's really cool. The next one we'll cover for in context is when you augment or modify an image. Now, the use case here is, we'll use the example of maybe you have a macro that blurs an image when the user hovers over the image, okay? So really what the render does is it takes the internal image, it puts some CSS on it, and so when the user hovers their mouse over it, it blurs the image, just an example. You could imagine how that looks inside of the Confluence editor. You have a big bodied macro with an image sitting inside of it. It's not the greatest experience because that's not what the page looks like when you save it and render it. What we can do today is instead of using a macro, we can get rid of that. We can make that directly a property of the image itself. So rather than a user inserting a macro, they can modify the properties. And we do this through the image property dialog. You're probably all familiar with this if you've ever edited Confluence and added images in, but like a lot of the dialogues inside, it is completely pluggable. A lot of the Confluence dialogues have a whole bunch of plugin points exposed in them. So we can simply add a new plugin point in here. You can see we have a new hover effect item on the left-hand side, and we can render whatever content we want in the right. In this case, it's a simple radio button to select how much hover opacity we want. But it's extremely good to use, and it really means that inside of your Confluence edit session, you get the richest experience possible because you're now adjusting the properties of the image rather than having to edit a macro to get the same effect. Again, a link there, developer.atlassian.com. The third pattern for in context really is along the same lines of the image property changes. It's for links, but rather than images. If you ever have a macro that generates a link as when it's rendered, so when you save the page, the view you see, the macro generates a link, you know when you edit the page, you'll see just the macro placeholder. Why not extend the link dialog the same way we do the property dialog so that we can get that richer editing experience. When the user edits a page, they see a link as a link rather than the link as this macro with a whole bunch of parameters. And again, it's extremely easy. You take the dialog, it's all pluggable, the link dialog's all pluggable, and you add it in. In this example I've created, you select whether you want to go to Stash or Bitbucket, you choose the repository there, and then you give it a title in the link text, and it'll generate that link for you. Again, the same functionality is entirely possible with a macro, it's just this is enhancing the user's editing experience inside of the Confluence editor. So it's useful if you have a lot of complex parameters or you need to really customize that macro editor there, but it's extremely simple to do. And again, like everything, developer.atlassian.com, complete tutorial on all of this. Now the fourth one, this is probably one of my favorite ones we have inside of Confluence. That is when you as a plugin or add-on developer wish to capture the content that the user's pasted into the editor. Now, it doesn't sound that great, but you can capture that and convert it on the fly to something else. And we have something called auto-convert inside of Confluence that we expose to plugin developers. And it's extremely simple. You just need to register a bit of JavaScript to register a paste handler. And then you can convert to anything. You can convert to wiki markup, you can convert to images, you can convert to another macro. And the prime example of this, if you've used Confluence with a linked up Jira instance, you'll know that when you paste in a Jira issue to that linked instance, it'll automatically convert that link to a Jira issues macro. Now this is a huge time saver for me. I absolutely love this. Going back to the status reporting example is my old workflow used to be, insert macro, this is the Jira instance, this is the Jira key, and save. And when you have to do that for 10 lines, it becomes quite tedious. This, on the other hand, allows me simply to paste in these Jira issued links, and it automatically converts them in line, inside of the edit session, into this Jira issues macro. So it's not only for links, and it's not only for Jira issues and macros creating. You can do the same thing with any other content the user pastes in. I think one of the killer features of HipChat that I really enjoy is that when I paste a link to an image inside of my chat session, it automatically renders that image in the session. You can do the exact same thing for here. You could write a very simple add-on that when you paste a link to an image into a Confluence page, it converts it to an inlined image of that in there. But like every bit of auto conversion we do inside of the Confluence edit session, it's simply a matter of hitting Control-Z or undo to get back to the original content that was pasted in. So the in-context pattern, I know there are a lot of them in there, but it covered these 4 main things. That was the image placeholder, extending both the link and image dialogues, the property dialogues for them, and extending auto-convert to really convert the user content as they paste it in. Heaps more info on all those links there, and as I said, the slides are going to be available afterwards, so you can go through, dive straight down into all the technical details and the implementation of those extensions. We're going to cover the second group of patterns here, and that is what I said, the editor pattern. And that is, sorry, it's the you're too big pattern, which is an editor pattern. And that is when you, as a macro or plugin developer, when your macro starts growing in size or complexity, you have too many macro parameters, or the macro parameters are not the right format to correctly represent it, and you want to provide your own custom editing experience. And that's exactly what we do. You can write your own custom editor for any of the macros inside of Confluence. Now, I'd like to show a few examples. This is the status macro. You can see it has 3 parameters: the title, the color, and whether or not to display it as an outline. 3 parameters, they're easily represented inside of the macro editor. I do not think this would be a good candidate to write a custom editor for. Okay? Very simple macro. Another one that's an example that I think would be is the Jira issues macro. Now, you can see here we've got 5 parameters on the right-hand side. That actually extends for another 4 of them down the page. It's just when I take the screenshot in Chrome, the scroll bars have disappeared. There's actually a scroll bar there. That's 9 parameters, and it's an extremely complex macro to configure every single time. Maybe this would be a good candidate for rewriting with a custom editor. But the one I'd like to really sort of highlight here is Gliffy Diagrams. If you've ever used the Gliffy macro inside of Confluence, you'll know it's an extremely smooth experience. From inside of the editor, inserting the macro prompts you with this dialog, which then takes you to a custom editing experience, the custom Gliffy editor rather, allowing you to create your document, save it, and then it gets injected back into the page. And you'll notice a few things about these. They may not seem, fantastic on their own, but when you start combining a number of these patterns, so the inline editing, the custom editor experience with image-based placeholders, you start to see how the user's edit session and their experience while editing a page can really be enhanced. And the best thing about this is it's extremely easy to do. Like a lot of these things, it's just about knowing where to find this information. All you simply have to do is call this setMacroJS override to set a custom editor. Everything inside that block then is invoked, and the standard Confluence macro editor is not. The best thing about this is that it covers every single way that you edit a macro. So whether you go through the insert menu, whether you go through wiki markup auto-convert, whether you go through auto-completion, or whether you click the edit button in the property panel, it'll always invoke your custom dialog code. And then it's simply a matter of reading the OWI docs, drawing up your dialog, and having all the parameters you want for your custom editor there, completely customized. It doesn't use the macro editor at all. So the 2 things here is just remember to use the setMacroJS override, and then you can give that really seamless experience, that really seamless one for inserting content and creating content through your custom editor inside of the Confluence editor. Again, heaps more documentation there at developer.atlassian.com. And the best thing about this one as well is that it's also available right now in Atlassian Connect. You can create a remote macro with not only a custom image-based placeholder, but also a custom editing experience. So these are available now. The third group of patterns I'd like to go over is really thinking of the 90%. That is, think of the 90% use case. How is your plugin going to be used 90% of the time? Okay? And there's really two main categories here. It's identifying common parameters and common functionality for your macro. And the second one is, are the parameters you've specified as required actually required, or can you as a developer provide some sort of sane default there instead of making the user select one? The first one we'll look at is, if I'm building a macro with a number of common parameters, it becomes a real pain in the user's workflow to have to edit that macro every time they want to change one. The prime example here, I'll get onto that in a moment, and the way we solve that is pushing that common functionality out into the macro property panel. So guys, if you're not familiar with the macro property panel, it is the dialog that drops down below or above a macro when you select it inside of the Confluence editor. By default, every macro will have the edit and remove buttons. That's always going to be there. But what this extension point allows you to do is put in custom functionality, custom buttons, custom text fields. The example here is the status macro. I'll be using this for a number of examples. However, in this property panel, you have all the colors for the status macro, as well as a text field to change the value on that. That means me, as a user, in my status reporting tables, in anywhere I use the status macro, I can select that macro and change the value of it simply by pressing one of those color buttons or entering a new value into the text field. You remember the alternate for this is to edit the macro, open the macro editor, change the values in it, and hit save. Now, it doesn't seem that much longer to do it that way, but when you have 10 or 12 of these, it really sort of enhances the user's experience inside of the Confluence editor to do it through the macro property panel here. And now, it's a big block of JavaScript coming, but all I want to point out here, this is purely for reference when you have the slides, but all I want to point out here is that it's simply a matter of invoking this insert macro on the macro utils inside of Confluence for updating the macro in line, and you simply call that from this register button handler. And that's all you have to do to add a new button into the property panel. You have the JavaScript inside of your plugin, register as a number of button handlers for all the functionality you want to add, and then for status macro, we simply style them with CSS, and you get the color boxes on them there. It's extremely easy to use, and there's a complete demo there on developer.atlassian.com. Now, the second one for the 90%, thinking about the 90% use case, is how many parameters can you have required? Like what do you need for required parameters? And really the solution here is to think about the parameters. Are they actually required? Now, I'd like to use an example of you have a macro, and maybe the macro interacts with HipChat. You have a requirement of an API key for that interaction. Obviously, there's no way you can think about providing a sane default for an API key. You can try and guess it, but chances are, most of the time, you're going to be wrong. Okay? You're not going to be able to provide a sane default for this. So that's a good example of a required parameter. The other case, however, is when you have something such as the status macro, which provides this color as a required parameter. This is an enumeration of 5 colors, and it is required here. They pick a default of gray, but it's required. And that has some knock-on effects. When any macro that has any required parameters, as soon as you insert that into your edit session, it prompts you with this macro editor here. You can't just insert it and continue working on your way. So as soon as you have that required parameter, your workflow is broken by this dialog that pops up and you having to make some choices there. This color here is something that's easily solved with the macro property panel and selecting it there. So that's the way I prefer to work with the status macro. I don't think this is correct here, but. So that's really the 90% pattern, and that's thinking about the 90% and how most of the use cases are going to be used for your plugin. Okay? Just remember the few key things that as soon as you have a required parameter, that's going to cause that macro editor to be displayed. That's going to break the user's workflow and prompt them to enter values into those fields so that you can render the macro. Obviously, not everything can have a same default like the API key example. You may have to get actual text into the macro parameters or prompt them for some actual value. And again, that's going to lead to a smoother user experience where they don't get interrupted with that dialogue. Now, this is the final set of patterns I'd like to talk about, and that's administration patterns. That's how you can help out the administrators of your instances or Confluence instances when they're using your plugin. And there's two areas to this. There is, how do you notify an administrator that some sort of configuration needs to happen for your plugin? Okay, we can use the same example, maybe the API key interacting with HipChat. You have some sort of HipChat macro, and the plugin requires the API key to be configured there. We'll use that as an example there. The other one is, how do you create a what's new dialog for your plugin? How do you notify administrators what all the new features are, how to best utilize your plugin? So we'll go over that as well. But this first one, it's, you have configuration that needs to be done. How do you notify the administrator? Again, the API key example. And the simplest way of doing that is to create an administrative task inside of Confluence. Now, is anyone here familiar with administrative tasks inside of Confluence? 1, 2, awesome. 3, cool. So what that is when you look, if you've ever administered a Confluence instance, when you look at the main administration page, you see this list of tasks, which are just basically a task item with a checkbox to say you've done it and a link to the appropriate configuration. Now, when you start up a vanilla Confluence instance, you'll see it's generally check the base URL, check if your mail server is correctly configured, and check out Marketplace. They're the 3 ones. You can check them off when you're done. Now, what we would like to do is add another one in there for when you add your plugin that says configure my API key for my HipChat plugin. And that is very easy to do. If you've ever written a plugin for any of the Atlassian products, you're probably familiar with web items. And it's simply a matter of creating a new web item and adding it to the appropriate section, which is listed there. Again, all this is going to be available later. The only caveat for this really is the condition. You want to specify a condition because if the user configures your plugin through UPM or through the administration menu on the left, you don't want this task showing up saying, hey, configure my plugin when it's already configured. So that's all that condition does. It marks the task as done if the user has already configured it. So it's extremely easy to do and just a matter of adding that web item. So this allows you to ensure that your add-on is quickly or easily configured. So when an administrator installs a new add-on, they don't install it thinking it's all okay. The users then go to use it, complain that it's not configured correctly, so they have to come back. This will actually prompt them in the administration task items saying, you need to configure this. It really improves the whole experience, not just for the administrators, but for all the users of that add-on inside of Confluence. And of course, the only sort of caveat there is remember to put the condition in. So if they do configure it some other way, it won't show up in the list asking them to configure it again. Again, developer.atlassian.com, all this information is available up there. Now, the next pattern is about how do we keep the users or the administrators or the people that installed your add-on up to date with what the new features are? How do we get them started with how to best utilize this add-on? How do we do those things? And the answer there is to configure the post-install or post-update URLs. Now, these are functionality of UPM. These are part of UPM, and so they're available across all the products for any add-ons, not just Confluence, okay? And what this does is when you configure a post-install or post-update URL, it means when the user installs your plugin, it will then render this URL inside of a dialog after they've installed it. So it's extremely useful. If you've ever updated any of Confluence or Jira, you'll see that what's new dialog pops up as soon as the first time you visit it again. This will pop up when the administrator installs the plugin. And it looks something like this for team calendars. You can see there's a dialog there, welcome, some of the highlighted features, as well as a getting started guide. So the post-install URL will pop up the very first time the plugin install is done. The post-update URL will be chosen when the user already has that plugin and they're upgrading it. So again, it's simple to configure these. You already have in your Atlassian plugin a plugin info block. It's simply a matter of these last 2 lines here declaring the post-install and post-update URLs. In the exact same fashion, you would define a configuration URL. They can point to the same location, they can point to different locations. It's all about the functionality you want to get out of it and the messages you want to send to the administrator when they install your plugin. So this is, as I said, install will happen on install, update will happen on update. And it's really about keeping them up to date about all the new awesome features you add to your plugin, as well as how to best utilize them and how to best use it. There is a caveat to this as well, which is that last bullet point on the slide, that these dialogs are only going to show when the plugin is installed through Marketplace, okay? If you install it via the upload plugin and then upload the jar, these actually won't render. So if you're testing it, there's ways we can get around that, but you can come speak to me later about that. And there's tons of documentation there. Again, developer.atlassian.com. So we've covered the 4 patterns here that I mentioned at the start. Really, the in-context pattern, remember, the content you render inside of Confluence, make sure it's contextually relevant to the rest of the document. You want to give the best WYSIWYG, the best editing experience to the users that you can. And the key things to remember there are, remember image macro placeholders. Can you replace your bodiless macro with a dynamically or static image, dynamically generated or static image? Is it relevant for yours? Think about the status macro, think about Gliffy Diagrams, think about the widget connector. Makes the editing experience a hell of a lot better just doing that. Think about overriding both the image property dialog and the link dialog if you edit images or if you provide links for the user. The link dialog especially, it's a lot easier inside of your edit session to see a link and edit that than it is to see a macro and know that renders to a link. And the third one is the auto-convert. Think about when you paste a link to a Jira issue, it automatically converts it to a Jira issue macro and all the functionality you can have there. Again, not restricted to links and not restricted to other macros. We covered the notification pattern, and that was the last one we covered, making sure the administrators know how to configure your plugin, making sure the administrators know all the new features, the what's new dialogues, the post-install and post-update URLs. Again, the you're too big pattern, providing a custom editing experience. So it's not only if your macro gets too big, okay? It's about if you have too many macro parameters or complex macro parameters, or you want to provide a more seamless editing experience for the user. Consider adding a custom editor, and of course, that one is available in Atlassian Connect right now, so you can utilize it both in Atlassian Connect and in plugins too. And the final was to think about the 90% use case, okay? That is, can you move common functionality out into the macro property panel? Or can you think about the macro parameters? Are they actually required? Or can you provide sensible defaults for these things? And it's a lot better to provide sensible defaults and no required parameters so you don't break the user's workflow inside of their edit session and bring that macro editor up. So they were the 4 we covered, and as I said earlier, they may not look like much independently, but when you start chaining them together to get that added functionality, think of the status macro or the Gliffy diagram macro, where you have image-based placeholders overriding the property panel to provide common functionality there, and that custom edit experience, you can really enhance the user's experience of your add-on inside of Confluence. And I'll say it one last time, and that's developer.atlassian.com. That is a fantastic resource for all the information and tutorials for utilizing all of these things. So all of the code examples I have here, and all the links, go to developer.atlassian.com and show you the full-blown tutorials on how to implement these things. So these slides will be available later. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day, guys, around at lunch. So if any of you have any questions whatsoever about this or about OnDemand, which I also work in, please feel free to hit me up and we'll have a chat. I love talking about this stuff. Thank you very much, guys.